David, what a pleasure to have you on the show today. How have you been doing?
I've been doing well. I've moved to
Mhm.
Amsterdam since we last spoke. So that's sort of
Mm.
the highlight of my life at the moment. Yeah.
So, US to Amsterdam, how is it going for you?
Well, it's like any big change. My partner's here. She's been here for a long time. And my daughter's close by in Germany. So I get to spend more time with her, which I'm really appreciating. And it's like every big transition, it's this patience.
Mm.
There's a lot of small steps, but it overall is going well. And I'm really enjoying being here.
Awesome, awesome. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm sure I have a lot of learning from this conversation coming soon for me and
Okay.
similar for our listeners. So, David, you're known for narrative coaching. And I've been really wondering, I think that nobody better than you can explain to us what narrative coaching is.
So it began actually in my first career when I was a grief counselor, just observing the things we were taught about grief and then what I
Mm-hmm.
observed about how people actually grieved. And they
Mm-hmm.
often didn't always match well. And I found the same in coaching. When I started there about almost 30 years ago, I got the idea and I thought, oh, this is a good avenue for me, but I just didn't really appreciate kind of more structured, linear, goal-oriented processes. So that was not my observation about how most humans actually live. And it felt like narrative coaching was really a way for me to bring both personal and social elements of ourselves into a natural conversation because people like to tell stories and the stories then become illustrations of how they think about themselves and how they situate themselves in the world and how they make sense and meaning of things. And so I wanted the conversation to feel like a natural conversation, not like somebody's being coached.
Mm-hmm.
And the model that we end up developing comes out of a rites of passage framework from anthropology, again, because we're coming alongside somebody trying to move through some kind of a change. And we're trying to, rather than guide them through our coaching model, we're just trying to observe like where are they on their change journey and what might need from me right now to kind of help them to take the next
Mm-hmm.
step. And we use all the material from their stories as our guideposts because everything in there is their current explanation of things, but also seeds of what's maybe on the horizon. And I found the embodiment of storytelling helps people gain access to themselves and how they feel and what they notice. So rather than trying to ask a sequence of powerful questions, we're more likely to be quiet and
Mm-hmm.
observe and inquire into the client's experience of themselves as they're telling us the story. And then we use what's emerging from that and we play with it a lot to see what might want to happen to their story about themselves or about their situation or about the other person that might free up more progress for them. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, it's just a really natural human approach to a conversation with the intention of serving someone who's trying to achieve something.
Mm-hmm. It's a very natural human approach to support humans. So tell me, what really is the key skill when people are playing that into action? So what are the
Yeah.
skills that we need to have for that?
I think if I had to pick one, it would be an ability to pay close attention
Mm,
to what's happening right in front of you in the field, in the energetic
mm,
space between you. Most coaches get, especially in the beginning, get caught up in their methodology or in themselves. So I've got to understand so I can be helpful and know what to say next. And so everything kind of comes from the client to us and then back out again. And we
mm,
try to just keep everything in front of us. Like, what are we
mm,
noticing? What's happening right now? And what seems important about that? And the willingness to be quiet and still and have what we think of as radical presence to what's in front of us is probably the most fundamental skill because everything that we end up doing in the conversation, by and large, comes from that space.
mm,
And if we lose touch with that space, again,
mm,
we're often back up into our head which is may not be where we always need to be because then
mm,
it becomes more about us and not about what
mm,
the client is trying to do.
mm. And how do you think that a narrative coach will do it differently, will not think about themselves and not focus on themselves, but rather on a client and what's in between?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a lot of unlearning for a lot of our coaches who are trained very differently. And I've got to
Mm,
go make these things happen. And there's still some spaces for that, but it's usually only when it's in service of the client, not in terms of our process. And so really it's just helping the coach to relax. And so we often paradoxically tell our students, please stop coaching just for a
mm,
moment. You're trying so hard to be helpful. which is great, but you're missing most of what's actually happening. And then if I were to point out, this is what I'm missing happening, they go, well, how did you even see that? Well, it's because I'm not worried about what I'm going to say next. I'm not worried about, I've got to figure this out, or I'm not worried about the fact that I don't understand their problem. I said, none of that matters yet. I want to just pay attention to what's here. There seems to be, say, for example, confusion in the field, and the client seems very unclear. So why is that? And what's happening around lack of clarity? And so the biggest thing is just getting a lot of our coaches just to put down the heavy load of, I've got to carry the conversation. I've got to understand and do the right things, all of which are noble intents, but are not as important as we might think, in the sense of everything that's going to not only happen in the session, but more importantly, everything that the client's going to be able to do when they leave the session is going to be anchored in that conversation, not in your head or in anything that was actually said, but in what the client's taking from the experience and making their own. And so I want to stay in that space. What are they paying attention to? What do they seem to have energy around? What are they gravitating towards? Let's go there. And so by paying close attention to what's happening as we're talking, it's much easier for the coach to do that.
And just be there instead of keeping that performance pressure most of the coaches have initially, right? So I got to make sure the client gets some results and actions immediately. Yeah. And I think that's how we also speak about doing and being versus doing, right?
Yeah.
Just be in the moment, then trying to figure out, what do I need to do?
Yeah, because if we trust that our clients are competent adults doing the best they can, and they are looking for some extra help from us as their coach, I want them to feel like we've holding that space for them and we're supporting them, but this is their conversation, not ours. If, like, for example, if you were to stop talking and the conversation died in a coaching session, it means the conversation was too dependent on you to keep it moving and keeping it energized and keeping it focused. And oftentimes clients become dependent on that. And so I want us to always be on the edge of what's going to happen next, and then increasingly enabling the client to pick up the baton of their own conversation and run with it. And by the time, I know that I've done well in one of my sessions when in some ways towards the end, the client has forgotten I'm even there. Even if I'm sitting right in front of them, or like we are now across the screen, because it means that they've owned this. They're working it themselves, and we're just kind of chiming in when they've decided that's useful to them.
And I really like that. What you said is, if the conversation ends in between, meaning that it's very dependent on the coach, it really has to be independent of the coach while you're in a coaching session. Yeah. Powerful. David, tell me now, I mean, you spoke in between about you being a grief counselor, right?
Yeah.
What parallels do you draw from there in coaching?
Yeah. So grief is a long and windy river. And even like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's the most famous person in that space, and it's like so many people, we've created a model around her thinking, which she never meant to be a model. And it doesn't really actually work that way. And we actually, and so it's helpful to know the kinds of experiences that people can have while they're grieving, but humans don't evolve in sort of nice, beautiful sequences and only in that order. They're wandering around, and they may be up one day and down another day, or be completely swiped by something. So the parallel for me is, it's the biggest thing that I learned when I was younger. I was only in my mid-20s, so but it had some big deaths in my family that was not talked about at all. So I thought that doesn't seem very healthy. So that's part of why I set out in that direction. But oftentimes, the biggest lesson I got was to just pay attention to the unique human in front of you and what are they experiencing. And rather than trying to look through your lenses of a model or a frame onto a conversation, letting the conversation come to you into the field and say, what do we notice about this? And the story I tell my students is that there was a woman that came in who was probably in her mid-40s, maybe. Her husband had died quite unexpectedly, and so she was in double shock. And some months later, she was really had this anxiety, like, in essence, am I grieving correctly? Am I grieving well? Or how am I doing? And because she was just so caught up in this really powerful experience for her. At one point, she brought in her husband's pajamas, who said, well, I sleep with these every night because it reminds me of him. Is that okay? And I said, well, you don't need my permission. Does it feel okay to you? Oh, yeah, it's very helpful. And I said, it's sort of like young children when they have objects, a stuffed animal or a toy or a book that becomes their transitional object while they kind of mature into being going to school or being more on their own. And these are important pieces. And I said, so that's your kind of touchstone. And, you've gone from all of this now down to this, right? And I said, and I imagine in time, you won't need them as much anymore. But for now, they clearly serve a valuable purpose for you. So I think, again, the parallel in coaching is that we often make things too big when clients really just want small steps to kind of find their way on a journey. That people have experiences that, even if we might recognize a pattern over time, just to be present to whatever is uniquely showing up right now. And then I think the third thing I recognized was that I had a lot of my own work to do to process the griefs I'd experienced. A couple of young children in my neighborhood died, and one in a fire and one of an illness. Two grandparents died. I moved a whole lot in my early life, so grieving spaces so there was one session I remember as a grief counselor where I started crying myself because I was very moved by this person's story. And my mentor said, well, that happens to all of us in the beginning because it's just a sign that you're ready for more work on yourself. And so I dedicated my life to kind of working through that issue for myself and understanding what that takes and what that looks like. And the parallel for coaching, then I'll stop, is that we can only travel with our clients as far as we've gone ourselves. And so if we have big things in our life we've never dealt with, it's going to be really difficult to do that with a client authentically and with integrity. And so the invitation, as with grief work, is just to do our own work. And it just helps us be cleaner and clearer in our coaching. And we can go to deeper spaces with our clients if that's what they need from us.
Very powerful. Thank you, David. Thank you. So, David, let's move back to narrative coaching and what we were talking. There's a 5 maturity framework as well. Are they associated?
Yes and no. So the 5 maturity, I've been writing about coaching and how do you develop better coaches for a long time. And I discovered that some academics in the UK had used one of my old papers to help ICF write the competencies for team coaching. I didn't find that until after the fact, but still I was very proud that they used my paper to write that. And so I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity to kind of update that because that's been a while. And so I took that as an inspiration. And I had long COVID, so I was not well most of the time. So I was using this as a distraction from not being well, and trying to write through brain fog was entertaining. So the 5 maturities connects to narrative coaching in the sense that one of the frames that underpins all of my work is what we call I-beam. It was my analysis of all of the factors that affect performance. There's 5 elements, and we often think about only 1 or 2 of them, and which is why our clients are not always as successful as we might like. So these are basically 5 factors we have to attend to, particularly when we're trying to help our clients be able to scaffold themselves to be successful with what they've decided to do in coaching. And it stemmed in part from a quote I saw once about the need to stop sending changed people back into unchanged environments, which it was his critique of his own company's leadership programs that he had built. And he said, because the environment always wins for the most part. And so it sits in narrative coaching because unlike most coaching, which is very individual and very around individual psychology, my belief and all my research would suggest that the stories we tell are profoundly shaped by our cultural narratives. You and I were raised in different cultures. Already we have different frames for certain things. And so, and even more importantly in some ways, our clients are returning to collective narratives in their company, in their neighborhood, in their place of worship. And so we need to be appreciative, to not impose our own values or our own biases on them, but also to help them figure out how am I going to, if I'm changing the story of myself, but I'm going back to say, visit my family, and my family has this other story about me that I'm trying to get away from, or that I don't like about myself, or maybe I once was a long time ago. How do I authentically bring my new story and still respect and be conscious of this collective narrative I'm now part of again. And so the five maturities, there's sort of relates to these five performance factors. And its fundamental insight was that it started as a critique of competency models, but then grew to realize that every skill or every behavior we want to develop, to be able to use that well and wisely, requires a maturity as a foundation. And we all know people that are like maybe coaching executives who are technically very good at what they do and very bright at what they do, but you don't really want to be led by them because they're not very nice person to be around, or they're just totally disorganized, or they're too whatever. And you see this a lot with people promoted from being a subject matter expert on a team to the manager of the team, not really realizing those are two different roles completely. And so I wanted to create the maturities so that we would start to focus more on who we are as humans, as coaches, and how mature are we as a human being, and to kind of balance us what sometimes feels like an obsession to read more books and go to more classes and get more content, as if that's going to make you masterful. It will to a certain degree, but if you don't have the maturity to apply well what you've learned, it doesn't really matter. And so the five maturities allows us to create a frame around all the way down to our own personal development, like maybe reflecting on a coaching session, like it didn't seem to go as well as I would like. What was missing? It gives us five categories to reflect on ourselves. But then it's also now I'm using it with a number of associations and whatnot to look at how would we think about assessing and developing coaches differently if we put maturity on par with competency. Because competency, so there's five maturities and each one has one mastery. So there's five masteries. Competency is only one of the five masteries. It's way overweighted in most Western professions. Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit more about those five maturities.
Yeah.
What are they?
So they run from the simplest in some ways to the most complex. So the simplest one would be our personal maturity. This is not about stage theory, although you could map this that way if you wanted to, but that's not my interest. But it's what can we draw on in ourself when we're working. So like, for example, if you've, as before, if we've never dealt with major grief in our life and we're confronting a client who between our sessions got fired and they're just in shock and you've never done that work for yourself, you don't have a lot to draw on because you're like you don't want the conversation to go there because it might make you feel uncomfortable. So it has everything to do with developing our capacity, which is the mastery part of this. So personal maturity is the work we do on ourselves. Capacity is what that brings us. I have the capacity to hold space for you while you're crying. I've done my own work on myself to be present to that and either not try to fix it or run away from it. So that capacity then allows us to feel more confident and grounded in ourselves, which means we're more able to see more. If I don't feel have much capacity, I just don't notice things. And the client might be, I see the client reaching for their tissue, but I don't want to look there because I'm afraid they're crying and I will feel uncomfortable. And so spiritual maturity is basically what can you see? It's the ability to make distinctions. It's the ability to shift perspectives. It's the ability to move up and down levels of awareness and to be able. And again, when I used to travel more and do a lot more demos, people would say like, well, how did you even end up talking about that? I said, it was right there in the conversation. They go, we didn't see that. I said, where do you look? Well, why do you think that was? And for most of them, it's because they were looking at what I was doing as a coach. They were looking for my coaching as opposed to looking what was actually happening in front of them with the person. So did you notice their facial expressions? No. Did you notice that their right shoulder slumped when they got to that part of the story? Did you know? No. And so I said, the skill here is to, like we said before, the skill really is to increase your capacity to notice in yourself, in the field, in the other person, in what's happening around you. And so that spiritual maturity is what allows us to deepen our capacity to notice.
So that's a spiritual maturity, right?
Yeah. Yes. And that for me, its mastery is clarity. The more we can see, the more truthfully we can see, the more we can get out of our own biases, the more clarity we have about what's actually really happening. And then that leads to the third one, which is the one we most recognize, is when we spend most of our time, which is our professional maturity. And this has everything to do with our competency. Do we have a basic grasp of the elements of the process that we're involved in? Do we have the basic grasp of all the steps, major components of coaching, for example, what it means to be a coach? And this basically has, what can we do? What about this process can we do? And again, this is where we spend most of our time. But one of the many downsides of relying solely on competency models is that they tend to be acontextual. So clients are worried about performing or conforming to the norm of I'm supposed to ask these kind of questions, even though that may be totally useless to the client at that moment in time. And yes, you have to be able to, for like beginners in particular, to some degree up to some intermediate levels. Yes, I want to know, can you ask a question? I want to know, can you be quiet and listen? I want to know, can you help somebody reach an agreement? But more of that doesn't make you a better coach, right? And so for me, they're competency models. And then, in some of these systems, when you get to the top, they say, well, we were just kidding about those. This is what really coaching is. I said, why don't you just tell them that in the beginning? So again, professional maturity and competency is essential for beginners. And if they can't pass that, then they've got more work to do to even be a coach. But beyond that, they need other things, which is why we have 5 and not just that one. The one is the one dwarfs the other 4 in most systems, but it really, in some ways, after a certain point, isn't even the most important. And I can think of one of my favorite mentors in my life had a 4th grade education, didn't know anything about coaching or mentoring or anything. And as a young man starting out in my career, I learned more from him than I did from my first 2 degrees. So in the 5 maturities, then, the distinction I make is between competency as a mastery and capability as a mastery. Capability requires a very different kind of focus, and it's our ability to do something well, to do it wisely, to do it in right timing. And for me, this is really an important piece. And again, it adds more nuance for us to be able to, mostly as a result of the maturity, which is our social maturity. It's our ability to read the room, understand the environment, appreciate the setting in which somebody is working, so that we can adjust what we're doing. And so somebody on LinkedIn the other day raised this really important point I'd never even thought about this way, but one of the things that some competency models she was working under, one of their things you got dinged on is if you interrupt the client. Thou shalt not interrupt the client. She goes, this person clearly has never been to my country. That's how we talk to each other. And if I don't interrupt you, it's considered rude because it means I'm not paying attention and I don't care.
Okay.
Yeah. And I know culture, I've been in some of those cultures. It's entertaining. It's a very different way of talking. I think they're being disrespectful. They're having a great time because that's how they talk to each other. And they consider my way of working standoffish and different, whereas and so capability is so important because I want to know, like, if I was observing a client, a coach, how did you come to choose that response? Where did that come from? And what are you hoping that's going to accomplish? And why do you think that's going to be useful for the client? And so this is where the thinking and the attuning that's so important for the coach at this level, and recognizing that what might be really good for one client might not be good at all for the other client, and what they're telling you is coming from their lenses, not yours, and might mean something different than you think it means. But it means then you're agile. You have the maturity. I'm agile enough to adapt how I'm approaching my coaching based on what this person needs most right now from me. And so then all that culminates in what we think of as the 5th maturity, which is the contextual maturity. And contextual maturity basically comes in the I-beam, comes down to our identity. It's our ability to have all of these in play at the same time. So we're able to draw on or sense each of the maturities and each of their masteries. We don't think about it consciously, but the more mature we become, the more this becomes who we are. And it's one of the reasons, like for me, we have faculty now running our practice groups in narrative coaching because it's really hard for me to explain anymore why I do what I do. I've lived this way my whole life. I have a PhD on this. I've written about this. I couldn't not do this. I mean, you can, and so, but it means I've lost touch with all this tens of thousands of scaffolds I've used to get to where I am. So having a faculty who are closer to the students on their journey, they remember. I remember how I learned to do that, and so the contextual maturity is to recognize what we know and we don't know, being able to show up more authentically, more holistically. It means, how sharp am I feeling on each of these maturities for myself today, and what factors feel most important in making decisions about what I'm doing in this session. And this one has to do with the last mastery, which is credibility. And the credibility we gain is twofold. One is if I showed you a video of you coaching, and for 5 minutes, say a clip of it, and I would ask you, narrate what's happening. Like, what was going on for you? What were you feeling? What were you noticing? What were you thinking? You will be credible to me if you can explain yourself. Because it's, wow, he's just so embodied this, and he's thought about this, and he's intentional and conscious about what he's doing. So there's an internal credibility, but also needs to be an external credibility, which is, does it work? The more mature we become, the easier it is for us to learn, to admit mistakes and improve them, to be more discerning on where to spend our developmental energy, rather than just randomly acquiring stuff, but really targeting our development around specifically what do I most need to attend to in myself right now in my own development that would make me a better coach. And so basically and each of these 5 pairs maps to the coaching conversation. Like I said, we can use them now to scaffold up a whole different way of thinking about developing and assessing coaches. And I don't think the competency models as they are do us any good. And I find people just sort of gaming the system a bit and having to conform to something. But I'm not sure that there is a good of a measure of how good somebody's as a coach as we might think. Like for me, if I were to take some of these competency exams, I think I probably would fail because they wouldn't recognize what I'm doing because I don't do most of those things. And so, other than, because it tends to focus on observable behaviors and skills, which again, it's the easiest thing to track, but it may or may not tell you anything about where the person actually is or why they're doing that. And it doesn't really, aside from behavior improvement, it doesn't really give you any clue about how to get better at it in a way that I think most people would find helpful.
Right. And it's a very intuitive process. I'm recognizing that, right?
Yeah. And so like you might have, for example, and this is where the maturity is so important, you might be an extraordinary at forming powerful questions. It may be just a really great gift you have as a coach. And you tend to get so caught up in that you end up asking too many of them, and it feels like an interrogation. So it's not like you need to get better at questions. You need to get more discerning about if and when they're necessary. That's a maturity issue. That's not a mastery issue. And so we know a lot of coaches who have developed quite good coaching skills, and their area of growth is not more of those. It's actually, how can you be more aligned with and attuned to which of those would actually be useful for the client. And so it comes back to our fundamental narrative coaching question, which is, what does this person need most from me right now?
What does this person needs most from you right now?
What do they need most, period?
And I also want to quickly recap those 5 maturity levels that you said. It says personal mastery. Can you just quickly go through them? Give me the names again. It says personal mastery.
Yeah, so there's personal maturity, spiritual maturity, professional maturity, social maturity, and contextual maturity. And then each one supports a mastery. So you have capacity and clarity and competency and capability and credibility.
Okay. Very interesting. And that's what you also mean then the integrative approach in coaching is.
Yeah, so the integrative approach, using integrative development, which is the third body of work, it's basically the learning and development theory that's part of narrative coaching. It also aligns to the five-factor model, IB model, and then links up to the five maturities and masteries as well. And there's a lot of things about that theory, but the part that's relevant here is recognizing whether you're doing a workshop or a coaching session, in some ways, it's wonderful if you have a great session or a great workshop, but in the end, it doesn't really matter if the person doesn't do anything or doesn't become anything as a result of that experience. If they got a few good tips, they're probably going to forget them by tomorrow. And so I've got really curious about how do we need to think about learning and development differently so that all of our hard efforts that we put in, because we give a lot to our clients, regardless of what form that's in. I'd like them to have better outcomes. They'd like to have better outcomes. And so as part of that, we look at in the Five Maturities paper, and I sent you the link to that, but that our primary goal objective is to do this for ourselves, but even more importantly, so we can do it with our clients. So at the end of the day, the purpose of my maturity, as far as my clients are concerned, is not me. It's my ability to be better serving them. And my focus is really on where do they need to mature, so that they have a better chance of delivering on what they've discovered. And we all know clients who have great sessions, but then don't do anything or really struggle, or we get excited with them and they butt off this huge thing and then it falls over. And so in terms of the client sessions, we want to help them mature themselves to create the strongest possible foundation for whatever it is they want to do differently.
And where do you think you would bucket or put the client into one of these five? So if the client comes in, has got a big aha moment, all of that is there, but they don't take any action. So where do you think they lack in terms of maturity?
It could be any of them, but let's just pick one. So it's like a lot of times, and this is where I think overly focusing on individuals in coaching is not always helpful, is so maybe the client, gets really clear, this is important to me. I see what it can do for me if I do this. They even develop some new skills or new whatever with your help as the coach to actually begin to practice some of that new behavior, say as a team manager or something. And then they go, great, good, now I can go out and try this. But they've done no thinking about how's that going to sound to my team, or how are they going to respond if I just show up one day totally different at the team meeting, or I change the entire structure of our team meetings. And so they lack social maturity. They've not thought about how do I need to adapt what I can now do to fit the context or the setting I'm now going to be heading into. And it's why in our narrative coaching model, we focus a lot on what we call sustain at the end. It's the going home. One of the, I think, broader downsides in coaching, which is what I'm hoping that ID and the Five Maturities will help, is that really like I said, the hallmark of a great coaching engagement is what they can do when they're done, not how they rated the sessions. And so coaching is not really set up that way very well. We get borrowed the psychotherapeutic hour at the very beginning and put a lot of pressure on that session. And which is good. We want to do a good job in our coaching sessions, but ultimately, I think it's somewhat of a misplaced focus. And one of the things about the future of coaching is, and this is where things like AI and things may or may not help us, but is to be able to understand how do we reframe coaching to be an end-to-end conversation from awareness all the way to action, all the way to integration. And so, like, for example, some of my clients, particularly ones that are super busy, often want, like, say, 4 15-minute segments, not 1 hour. They're working on something, they want to just kind of connect the dots between things they're trying with that one thing. And I've a friend of mine and we've sort of pioneered WhatsApp coaching that we want people to report on things they're doing with what they decided in coaching in real time on WhatsApp, and they want a response as fast as possible. And so we're sort of the guide on the side there with them as they're moving through their day. Hey, I just tried, we talked about it. It completely failed, but I think I understand why. I'm going to try it differently next time. What do you think? Boom. So it's a 2-minute exchange, but it's in real time and it's to meet right the client exactly where they're at. And the problem with coaching is that oftentimes they needed this session yesterday. Well,
Mm.
they actually need it tomorrow, not today, because of
Mm.
where it kind of fits in their developmental journey. And so
Mm.
I think one of the things that's coming in the future of coaching is more freedom and willingness to move outside the classic hour-long coaching session.
Mm.
Yeah.
What else do you see as a future of coaching? So one is, moving outside, and I'm also listening about the competency-based framework, so moving out of that as well.
Yeah.
What else do you think is the future?
Well, I mean, having interviewed some of the pioneers of coaching, many of them regretted even using the word coaching in the beginning because it brought over too many associations with sports and things. And so I feel like what I'm observing is a number of things. That coaching did kind of come in, especially in organizations around a performance kind of orientation. Then we kind of added in more of a developmental orientation. One of the things I see not only is flexibility in formatting coaching, I see hybrid coaching with drawing on apps and AI and other resources around us, smartwatches and all kinds of things to give us kind of more real-time data, but real-time support kind of as we need it. And that to be able to pay for an hour of a coach's time is a luxury the vast majority of the people in the world do not have. But everybody would benefit from coaching in some way. So I think it's going to take on many, many new forms. I think there was for a lot of reasons, some I think are valid, some not. There was this pretty stark rejection in early days of coaching that we're not therapy. And you should never talk about the emotions of the past. And I think it's completely hogwash. Every engagement with a client has a therapeutic function. Something often needs to be healed, restored, resolved in order to enable them to feel more mature and capable of doing something. And so, like for me, the benchmark is: am I in integrity with myself?
Mm.
Am I only doing things I feel qualified to do? Am I in integrity with my agreement with the client? Are we doing what they asked for, not what I think they should? And then
Mm.
thirdly, if there's stakeholders, am I in integrity with my agreements to them? And beyond that, I might wear 10 different hats in a coaching session and 10 different roles I can play because I have degrees or backgrounds. And then there's some so if I have a client who we discover they're sort of teetering on the edge of addiction.
Mm.
I know some about that, but I don't consider it my expertise. And there's people in the world that are brilliant at that. So I'm not going to pretend. My job might be to coach them to go take advantage of something and kind of hold their feet to the fire and hold their hand a bit. But my job is not to go into a space where I don't feel qualified. And so what that means uh, around kind of what we end up doing is that I think the future of coaching is going to see more and more integration with the mental health field because of the nature of a lot of the difficulties most humans are experiencing right now, even to get through the day. All the things happening around us and all. And so I think that artificial barrier between therapy and coaching is dissolving. Most therapists now are charging more. They can charge more money as a coach, and they're bringing coaching skills into their therapy practice sometimes. And I think our clients need more from us in that space than they might have in the past.
Right.
And then so if I think about the 5 maturities, so we've focused coaching and coach development almost exclusively on competencies and professional development. And said, stay in that lane. I think I never believed in that. So I never did that. But I think it's even more not helpful now because where clients really need us to go is at both ends of the spectrum in their personal and spiritual development, right? How do I stay sane? How do I stay focused? How do I stay hopeful? How do I stay grounded? I'm tuning things out, or I'm trapped in my own bubble. So their humanity's at stake, right? That has nothing to do with competencies that way. It's their life as humans. But I also think another area that we need to explore more are the social and contextual dimensions. You think about that even around tensions around returning to the office. You think about tensions between religions, tensions between cultures and countries and ways of and views of life. And so these are complicated and they're inflamed at the moment in many ways, right? And so we can't pretend those don't exist, right? And for us and for our clients. And we need to kind of find new ways of being together, having more hospitable cities, having better neighborhoods, having better relationships, better relationship to our environment, right? So these are all things where I think coaching has a role to play as people that know how to hold space for important conversations and developmental conversations. And so I don't know what that looks like, but I just think that's where if we pretend it doesn't exist, I think coaching will get a much, much smaller space. And then lastly is contextual, which is most of us feel overwhelmed, right? So the whole idea, how do I integrate all that's happening in my life, all that's happening around me, all that's in the news, all that I'm supposed to be learning, all the things that are changing? Even to talk like that is exhausting. And so I think for me, my wish, which is my gift to the Five Maturities to coaching, is as one resource to start thinking about yourself as a whole human being. You need to care and develop yourself so you can help clients do the same. And it requires maybe not more work, but different kinds of work. So it's more sort of interlacing and interweaving and maturing work than it is acquiring. And I just think that's where both in research and my observations suggest that we would do well to go as in coaching. Yeah.
And interesting what you spoke about the artificial boundaries between coaching and therapy. And I think therefore people do say coaching is therapeutic for people.
Yeah.
And I'm also noticing, the 5 level of maturities that we're talking, it's really a very holistic view of personal development as a human to look at it for ourselves rather than for our clients.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. So what else you think about AI, by the way? How is AI going to shape for us as coaches?
Oh, I don't know. It's a huge conversation. I've done some panels and things on ethics and AI and coaching. I work as the head of the Ovida labs for an AI company called Ovida, and they're using my work to help them build the next generation of their platform, which basically helps people get and use feedback to improve their coaching or leadership or sales skills. And so, the field changes so profoundly, radically, and it's hard to know, kind of where it will all go. For me, I just look at it as, like many others, I'm not sure artificial intelligence was the correct frame for what this is. So that's kind of misleading in itself, but because it's not really intelligence. So I think the positive that I see is that I use this for myself to save some time, like in writing drafts. So I don't go out to large language models. I feed it all of my things I've already written and say, somebody's asked me to write about X using my frame. So what have I said about X in the past that might be relevant here? And I feel it's harvesting. It saves me enormous amounts of time having to go through everything I've written and pull things out, and it just kind of gets me started, and maybe gets me 40% of the way there, 50% of the way there. So I think it has some rudimentary benefits that way. We're finding that now with some of the new capabilities that it actually is getting better and better at feedback and better at recommending from within knowledge bases that you give it what you might do to improve on something. And so what it does then is it won't ever it's not going to replace us, but it's going to say it can point out rudimentary things that and so it's going to kind of get you started, and then use the human to say who can notice more of the subtleties, notices more of the nuances, knows you. Knows what you're capable of, know what you're caring about. And so we have a lot of supervisors that use the platform because they can cut their review time, say, of videos by 80% and pick up 80% of what they would have spotted anyways. So the AI misses a few things because around subtleties of language and things, but even with that, it already provides way more data than you're ever going to do anything with anyways. And but allows then to the human supervisor to come in and look at did it miss anything significant? And if not, how do I help the person discern out of all that, what do they want to actually focus? And then we can even work with AI to help construct some plans around that.
Mm,
So I just look at it as it's a nice, if you know what it is and what it's not, it's a great resource to kind of elevate your time to focus
mm,
on what you can uniquely do and helps track a lot of things that you might miss. It
mm,
helps you not have to focus so much on taking notes
mm.
because it does most of that pretty well and good enough.
Yeah.
And
Mm,
again, we miss things too. So we're
mm,
not perfect as humans, but I think to ask are they the same or will it replace us is not really that relevant of a question. It's can we continue to find productive ways of using it that
mm,
help us do what we do better and more often? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes. It does.
mm,
It's very much useful that way.
mm.
Um, and I think time will tell what people will gravitate towards. But I feel like it's really a wonderful resource when used well. There's always
Mm,
larger meta issues around technologies and cultures and power and thing and money, and I can't control that. What I can control is how is it used in the Ovida space and how do I use it in my own practice. And so I tell my clients if this would be helpful to you to, scaffold some things, like maybe you're not very good at making lists. So you just end up
mm.
making, and so great, ChatGPT can do that really well for you. And again,
Right.
an expert in list making might say, oh, it's only 70% what I would do.
Mm,
Well, it's 70% more than they had before, which was zero.
mm,
So then, if the person can say, well, I can get started with this, they're going to
mm,
learn some things by finding things that don't work for them. If
mm,
it's really important to them, they can get some coaching by an expert on list making and
mm.
then learn from them about how to make this, and they can then change the prompt next time to get a
Right.
better list. So I think it's a nice resource for scaffolding that can, I think, help us a lot in developing ourselves.
And it, of course, cannot replace coaches, right?
No. But
No.
that's again yeah. But again, I think if one of the bigger issues among many that are driving this conversation, I think which is everywhere right now about the future of coaching is, I think rather we assume in that worry about it's going to replace coaches, that coaching is one thing and that coaches are one thing. They're not. The word coaching and coaches, there's a gigantic umbrella under which so much sits right now. And so I think part of what the challenge that AI has brought to us is it's going to force us to be much clearer about what coaching is and much clearer about what a coach is. And so, because in some professions already, AI is more accurate and better than humans.
Right.
And coaching is different in some ways, but
Mm,
only for now.
mm,
And I think, again, if we go back to what I was saying before, we think more broadly about what is the journey someone needs to go on to change something about themselves. A
mhm,
session is only drops in the bucket along a longer journey that they probably were on even before they started seeing you. And so, what does that say then about what is the purpose of our sessions? And what else might we do to augment that journey to help them in all the other
mm.
places when they're not in a session? And this is again where I think technology could be helpful. And we're in the early days of trying to figure out what that looks like. But um, to provide more consistent scaffolding at scale, at low cost, tell people with what all the research has suggested for decades need in order to successfully change, say, a habit. Um, yeah,
David, you're breaking up for me. No, I don't know if you can hear me okay now.
I can, I can.
Okay. For a minute, you broke up. Your lines unclear.
Hmm. 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 Hmm.
Sorry, David. We got cut off. Some internet issues.
Okay, all good.
All right. So we were talking about the future of coaching, and you've spoken about mentor for yourself, and the age and experience and all of that is not so important. What's your view on mentoring then?
On mentoring?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is wisdom. There is a certain wisdom that only really becomes possible later in life. I'm not sure everybody arrives there, but for me, it's one of the things I think mentors do, and some are planned, some not. They offer you a perspective that was just the right thing at the right time.
Mm.
And, like my dad he was a great guy, but he was gone a lot at work and he didn't have siblings and didn't know a lot about parenting sometimes in the beginning. And so this guy I was thinking of, that story was when I was in my early 20s and trying to find my way and who am I going to be in the world now? And, and oftentimes for kids, you may or may not get that from your parents. And so it wasn't like Carl said anything super profound. Like if he were to say those things to me today, they would mean not very much because I like, well, of course. But back then I was like, wow.
Mm.
And they were just little, like we used to call them Carlisms, little quotes, little things. But for me, it just provided some like perspectives that I just didn't have enough maturity and age at that point in my life to grasp. And I'd left home and so I think, and sometimes, mentoring can come from somebody younger than you. I was trying to remember. Oh yeah. We were, I helped build a program where I used to live on intercultural coaching. And it was basically for people that weren't necessarily coaches, most weren't, but they had to do a lot of coaching between two cultures. So like there was a woman that was a Caucasian woman that was in charge of all the Latino people that worked for a very large landscaping company. So she's having to go between these two cultures, the white owners and I think almost exclusively Hispanic laborers. But anyways, there was a woman in the group who was very quiet, didn't speak a lot. And then I wanted to get some more of her backstory. And so this was a mentoring for me about a perspective that so much of what is happening for people is not visible to us. And she just told the story about growing up in a mixed neighborhood in Europe, and it was right then when the war in Bosnia broke out, and she was of one group, and her best friend's family across the street was another group. And then by that morning, we're now on opposite sides of the war that they didn't choose. And she left to go to school. Everything was fine. She got urgently called back home and discovered that other people had killed her friends across the street because they were the enemy now, even though they were neighbors the night before. And I think I just got and so it was mentoring for me because if I connect back honestly to my own grief counseling training in my 20s, I realized even though I had been through a lot myself, I was still coming from a fairly stable and privileged place. And here's a person whose whole life she got taken away and never went back, and then realized things, and now is working with refugees, and it just gave me a much deeper appreciation for. It wasn't like it was a novel story. I'd been around other cultures and other peoples that had been through war. I traveled. I wrote a book in one of those places once years ago, but there's something about it. There's just helped me appreciate what somebody has to do, especially at a young age, hold a center of themselves and hold a center of their universe while it's just being lobbed around by forces that the child has no control over. And if I was a child in Gaza, and like, how do you? And so one of the things that I've never really thought about it this way before, but one of the things that really struck me about her story, we went out for lunch one day because I wanted to hear her story, and it was just amazing, was it really, and I'll give her credit for this, it really helped me to understand, in psychology, it's sort of called a locus of control, but the importance of having that core identity in ourself. that we can do this, we can make this, we can survive this, we can get through this. And I think in a way, I again thought about this till now, but it really informed my fascination with maturity. In my observation, we have a lot of very mature leaders in the world at the moment, but it's this maturity for me is, can I find the core of myself? There's an existential core. Can I find the better part of myself to try to do the right thing more often? And if people don't have that sense of agency, or don't have that sense of permission in their identity, or don't have an environment in which that's welcomed, then all the rest of the stuff becomes really not as important because they can't use it.
Right.
And yeah, so. Yeah.
Interesting. David, what a wonderful hour spent with you. So much of learning. I've written so many notes about what you spoke. So, and you did mention you're going to share something for us to read, right? A document or something. You're going to put that in the show notes for people.
Yeah, so it's in the document that I sent you on the Google form, and it's in the bio. You can just provide the link to the website, and they can download the Five Maturities report. It's a big report I wrote last year on the Five Maturities. We'll make an update to it this summer, and we are now running Guiding Lights retreats built on the Five Maturities as well. Yeah.
Sure, I'll keep that as well. So it's Guiding Lights retreat we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. David, what a pleasure to host you today. I'm looking forward to speaking to you later as well. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Harris. All right.
Well, thank you, David. Bye-bye.